They say, kings are born, not made. But what if the crown rests upon the head of a man already cursed in the womb? Ferdinand, Prince of Asturias, first saw the light of day in the summer of 1784, the result of generations of inbreeding among Europe's royal houses. Court physicians made a private report to King Charles IV. The prince's genitals had grown to an alarming, unnatural size. Not just large, grotesque, misshapen, asymmetrical, veined like a root system crawling out of some dark, mythical soil. They called it a divine anomaly in public. In private, they called it monstrous. Daughter of King Ferdinand I and Queen Maria Carolina, herself the sister of Marie Antoinette. She was 16, beautiful, and devout. She was promised to a prince, and delivered instead into a private hell. Leather restraints, crafted by the same artisans who made the king's saddles, were used to bind a young queen to her gilded bed. Perfumed oils and sacred ointments were applied by trembling maids. On more than one occasion, the floor of the royal bedchamber had to be scrubbed clean of blood. Witnesses said the king's eyes would roll back in his skull, not in ecstasy, but in fury at the act itself, as if he were trying to conquer his own body by punishing hers. Astrologers consulted, potions from Constantinople, priests and apothecaries walking the same marble halls. It became ritual, a grotesque repetition of hope and pain. When she finally died in 1807, at just 21, the official cause was listed as fever. But the palace knew. Everyone knew. He was a child born not merely into privilege, but into a decaying bloodline. Behind the brocaded curtains of the Spanish court, whispers spread quickly. Servants spoke of the infant's strange proportions. His limbs were soft and bloated, his skin pale. But it was in adolescence that his body began revealing its true betrayal. By the age of 13, as Ferdinand grew, so too did his affliction. His anatomy became the dark joke of European courts. Paintings of him had to be subtly altered to hide the unnatural bulge beneath layers of silk and velvet. The man Spain would one day call king. The second child nearly survived, but the labor nearly killed the queen. Her body could take no more. He believed she had sabotaged the pregnancies, that she'd conspired against him, poisoned herself, cursed his seed, nor could her mind. Behind closed doors, doctors debated whether surgery was even possible or survivable, but no monarch could rule without an heir. When he came of age, the Spanish court arranged a match. Maria Antonia of Naples. From the outset, their marriage was a theater of horror. Ferdinand, already paranoid and deeply ashamed of his deformity, approached the marital bed like a battlefield. Physicians, alchemists, and court-approved mystics were summoned to prepare elaborate rituals to ensure a successful conception. Maria Antonia, poor creature, was sedated with increasing doses of laudanum before each scheduled encounter. Not too much, just enough to render her pliant, enough to muffle the screams. What took place in the royal chambers defied both love and reason. When the door closed behind him, it was as if the Inquisition had returned. The queen would emerge hours later, carried by her ladies-in-waiting, unable to stand. And yet, no child came. Month after month, year after year, the Spanish court waited, hushed prayers, in cathedral chapels. Then, against all odds, Maria Antonia conceived. Twice. The first miscarriage came in the 4th month. She wasted away in the palace like a ghost, addicted to laudanum, whispering to saints in the dark. She had died from her marriage. Ferdinand showed no sorrow, only frustration. And thus began the dark legend of a man who ruled not only with a broken heart, but with a broken body. But this was only the beginning. A widower at 23, Ferdinand did not mourn as other men do. There were no long walks in shadowed gardens, no portraits veiled in black. He didn't speak her name again, not with sorrow, not with reverence. He spoke only of her womb, a useless, treasonous vessel, and of his seed, which he believed to be sacred and cursed. With Maria Antonia gone, Ferdinand did not retreat. He redoubled his efforts. The court became a laboratory of lunacy. No longer content with the council of physicians, the prince invited astrologers, mediums, The royal bedroom was converted into a kind of celestial altar. 1 part medical theater, 1 part temple of madness. Charts of lunar phases were pinned beside anatomical diagrams. Incense from the east was burned nightly, thickening the air with sweet rot. At its center, a tent of silk and bone. Inside waited a mystic who claimed to be from the Orient. A fraud, likely, but one whose lies aligned perfectly with the prince's madness. He spoke often of dragons, serpents, divine rods. He had come to believe that his deformity was not a burden, but a mystical artifact. The queen, pale as bone, thrashed in her bed as blood soaked through lace and silk. Screams echoed through the stone halls, louder than even the bells of Madrid. The women, weak, willful, secret enemies of God's plan, that the dragoness rod would only yield an heir when the stars themselves were made to obey. Saturn eclipsed Ferdinand believed the heavens themselves must kneel before his need. Her apothecary was found dead days later. A letter beside his corpse. Guards stood with halberds at either end of the corridor. A white cloth hung from the chamber door during the procedure, not unlike the veil at a cathedral, signifying sacred, unspeakable rites, snatched by royal guards before anyone else could read it. Leather harnesses, silk restraints, seeking fatherhood in a pit of horror and delusion. Wooden devices shaped by the same artisans who made the king's saddles. The royal workshops, once known for their masterful carriages and ceremonial arms, were now rumored to produce marital tools designed not for love, but for enforcement. The rituals that followed were obscenely theatrical. Chanting in foreign tongues. Candles, shaped like phalluses, coital positions, copied from so-called Eastern scrolls. That his grotesque member was a sign of destiny, misunderstood by lesser men and weak-willed women. One night a caravan arrived under moonlight. This mystic declared that Ferdinand's deformity was proof of heavenly favor. For 3 months, the royal palace became a sanctuary of sexual alchemy. Just enough to keep them quiet. His journals, never meant for public eyes, are filled with phrases repeated like mantras. My flesh is not cursed. The stars are not yet aligned. The wombs are wrong, not I compliant, to make it through the nightmare without screaming too loudly. And then, miracle, twice more, Ferdinand's consort conceived. Twice more, Spain held its breath. And twice more, the fetuses died within the womb. The second miscarriage near full term was an especially gruesome affair. She survived the labor, but not the year. And Ferdinand, he did not weep. He seethed. He began to believe the fault was not in him, but in them. He accused his dead wife of moving deliberately during pregnancy to cause miscarriage. He ordered her servants interrogated. Ferdinand became obsessed with control. He would never again leave conception to mere chance. He ordered a new series of instruments. Not medical, not surgical, but something in between. This wasn't intercourse. This was conquest. Astrologers were brought in to dictate the exact hour of each ritual attempt. Lunar conjunctions. Venus rising. Court protocol dictated that all doors be sealed. And always, the laudanum, whoever his chosen partner was, cousin, courtier, foreign princess, they were first sedated. Still, the palace walls heard everything. After each failed attempt, Ferdinand would retreat to his private apartments, pacing for hours, muttering about betrayal and destiny. Outside, Spain was fraying at the seams. Revolts, famines, whispers of colonial collapse. Inside, its future king was measuring stars and blood, and all the while, Europe watched, silent, curious, horrified, because even among kings, Ferdinand was becoming something else. A myth, a warning, a monster, and his reign hadn't even begun. In the spring of 1814, Ferdinand returned to Spain not as prince, but as monarch. The people, starved by war and battered by Napoleonic rule, greeted him as a savior. Flowers were thrown, knees bent, faces wept at the mere sight of his carriage. Some called it divine providence, others called it madness. His journals spoke only of heirs of lineage, the sacred burden still unfulfilled between his legs. But in the eyes of Spain, the boy king had come home, but his obsession had only deepened. Only Ferdinand knew the truth. He hadn't returned to lead, he had returned to breed. A cousin, naturally, behind the courtly smiles and public declarations of restoration, the throne had been The very night of his arrival, he ordered his ministers to begin discreet negotiations for a new bride. He was no longer a boy. Pale, twitching, his lips barely moved through the vows, his eyes never once met hers. The palace bled the truth, whisper by whisper. Choirs flown in from the cathedrals of Toledo. Furniture overturned, a shattered mirror. The queen's ladies were summoned with urgency and silenced her, wrists bruised, her lips bitten through from stifled screams, not of passion, but of pain. Refused to enter rooms if Ferdinand was inside. And panic. 27 courses at the banquet, and a gown stitched with diamonds taken from the colonial mines of Brazil. One attendant wrote that she once attempted to claw through a locked door in her sleep, sobbing for my mother. Someone, anyone. He was 30, and his desperation now carried the weight of an entire crumbling empire. And, reportedly, a strange physician from the Ottoman Empire known only as the Knife. Within 2 years, a name was chosen. Maria Isabel, of Portugal, 19 years old, a porcelain princess from the same cursed Bourbon bloodline. She arrived in Madrid full of soft hopes and soft smiles. Her letters described a city of light, in a court of music, but her attendants knew better. They had been briefed, quietly, discreetly, by palace physicians who used terms like sensitivity, preparation, and medical cooperation. What awaited her was not a marriage, it was a ritual. The wedding ceremony was grotesque in its splendor, gold-embroidered vestments. But Ferdinand stood at the altar like a man awaiting execution. He had spent the week in seclusion meeting, not only physicians, but alchemists, astrologers. This man would vanish from Madrid within days. Some say he was escorted out under cover of night. Others claim he was buried beneath a palace. That night, the wedding night, became legend. What transpired in the royal bedchamber would never be fully documented in the court's official records, but the servants knew. The guards knew. There were screams. Servants found blood on the floor. The white linens, meant to prove virginity, were instead a canvas of trauma. For weeks after, Maria Isabel did not speak in full sentences. She developed a stammer, flinched at sudden movements. She began to faint in church, wake screaming from nightmares. The court called it hysteria. Today, we call it trauma. And Ferdinand, not with guilt, but with resentment. He believed Maria Isabel had humiliated him, that her terror was a judgment upon his manhood. He accused her of plotting to embarrass him, of conspiring with foreign enemies to mock his sacred condition. Her letters were her meals tasted for poison, her sheets inspected nightly for evidence of treasonous intent. Within months, the queen became a ghost within her own palace, pale, silent, unseen. And Ferdinand, he became more alive than ever, drunk on suspicion, on power, on the illusion of progress. Sketched diagrams, discussed girths and angles and ligament. He summoned a panel of doctors, French, German, Italian, and Spanish to solve the air problem. The royal bedchamber became a medical theater, not a place of intimacy, but experimentation. Witnesses were invited to observe attempts at procreation. A court physician's private diary recounts one such night in vivid horror. The king entering in ceremonial garb, the queen already sedated. Instruments lined up like holy relics. They took notes. This was not medicine. This was pornography, masquerading as science. Isabel, the Virgin Queen, was dissected before she ever carried a child. And still no heir. Authorized torture. Arrested anyone who whispered about the condition. But Spain was watching. So were its colonies burning for revolution. From Mexico to Argentina, rebel pamphlets mocked the king. A man who cannot rule his wife, cannot rule a nation. Ferdinand responded the only way he knew how. With terror, he reinstated the Inquisition. Even married couples were spied on lovers, imprisoned for pillow talk deemed and through it all, he hunted shadows. She died 2 years later. Official cause, nervous collapse. Her confessor whispered otherwise. He built secret passages beneath the palace to spy on his own wife, installed mirrors angled to catch the corners of her bedroom, had her portraits burned when she refused to smile. The palace, once a symbol of Spanish glory, had become a dungeon. And at its center, Ferdinand, king of nothing, father to none, master of a nation he no longer understood. The queen. She had asked God to take her. He had listened, but Ferdinand's war was far from over. There were more wives to come, more screams, more ghosts, and still no heir. Ferdinand VII buried his second wife with a whisper, not a prayer. But the whispers did not stop. The palace echoed with talk of blood, of torn skin, of screams. The queen had died, they said, of exhaustion. But the maids knew better. They washed the bed sheets. They carried her limp body to the bath. Ferdinand's grief was a theater of madness. He refused to eat for 3 days, then demanded to see her body again. Not once, but 7 times. He stroked her cold cheek, kissed her lips, beside that of his first wife, beside the anatomical sketches of his own tormented organ, a gallery of the dead, watched by a king who believed himself cursed by God and mocked by flesh. Called her my unfinished duty. He had a death mask cast from her face, placed it on a velvet pedestal in his chambers. But the realm needed an heir, and so, by the end of that same year, his ministers returned to their grim task. Find another bride. She had been warned. Potential brides declined. Negotiations collapsed when physicians demanded detailed accounts of the previous queen's deaths. One princess refused outright after hearing the phrase marital preparations in a letter from Madrid. Ferdinand was pale and thin, his eyes sunk in blackened sockets, his fingers twitching like puppet strings cut too soon. But who would marry this king? Whispers of Ferdinand's anatomy had spread through Europe's courts. But money speaks louder than blood. And so, from the bankrupt house of Saxony came Maria Josepha Amalia, 24 years old, unmarried, and, most importantly, dispensable. Not just the failure, but the detachment that Saxony would blackmail him with anatomical drawings. Maria Josepha did not scream. She did not cry. She measured. She arrived in Madrid in 1819 with a physician of her own choosing, a chest of medical devices, and the air of someone about to enter an asylum. She did it anyway. The wedding was joyless. The guests, sparse. The altar flowers wilted in the July heat. When they kissed, she did not close her eyes. The third marriage was not one of passion, or even pain. It was surgery. Each scheduled attempt at intimacy was recorded with scientific precision. Hour, temperature, dosage, lubricant composition, mechanical assistance. Colonies fell like rotting teeth. New Granada, Peru, Mexico, gone. Maria Josepha kept a logbook. Her physician monitored her pulse before and after each encounter. Sex had become autopsy. Ferdinand hated it. Physicians wept. Ferdinand wept harder. She made him feel less like a man and more like an object of study, a failed experiment with a crown. Soon, he began to suspect her, that she was documenting his condition for foreign agents, that her physician was secretly sketching him. He had her letters opened. The physician was dismissed. The king's paranoia bled into every corner of the court. In Spain, Spain burned. Revolution simmered in the Americas. Alchemists. For 6 days, the palace reeked of rot. Servants wore perfume-soaked handkerchiefs. Physicians pretended to try. Ferdinand screamed at their failures. Priests, he insisted her chambers be blessed daily, that her food be sanctified, that she wear relics of St. Catherine on her thighs. He watched. From mirrors, from people, from shadows. And the king. He spent fortunes importing foreign doctors, testing mechanical phalluses, trying alchemical potions and Catholic relics soaked in saintly blood. The court dissolved into silence. Ministers waited days for an audience, while the king consulted circus contortionists who promised to unlock his vital passageways. He was not a ruler. He was a dying star of sexual gravity, pulling everything around him into collapse. And then, in 1829, it happened. The bride glowed, not from joy, but gestation. Ferdinand did not care, or perhaps he did, but he needed an heir more than he needed truth. Her final words, whispered to her confessor, "Now I can sleep." Maria Josepha announced a pregnancy. The court rejoiced. The church declared it a miracle, but the miracle would not last. At 7 months, complications emerged. Placental abruption, they'd call it today. Bleeding, pain, weakness. Ferdinand, instead of trusting doctors, summoned mystics. On May 18th, Maria Josepha went into early labor. Ferdinand insisted on supervising the delivery in person. He stood in the birthing chamber, hands clasped behind his back, as if awaiting a military report. The child, a daughter, was born blue, gasping, barely alive. She lasted 5 hours. Maria Josepha survived, briefly, but the infection came quickly. 3 weeks later, she was buried beside her predecessors. And Ferdinand, he refused burial, ordered resuscitations for both mother and child. When they were finally interred, he placed their death masks beside the others. A holy trinity of silence. He no longer ruled, until one final plan emerged. Desperate, absurd, divine in its cruelty. A fourth marriage. To Maria Cristina of Naples. What the king didn't know, what everyone else did, was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant. Not with his child, with another man's. The wedding was a sham. In 1830, Isabella II was born. She was the culmination of his entire life's obsession, a child that could only exist because he had failed. By the time Isabella II took her first breath, the Kingdom of Spain was already suffocating under the weight of her supposed father's delusions. She was not his, but she was all he had. The people cheered. The palace bells rang. Diplomats sent congratulations, wrapped in golden paper. But Ferdinand's mind was elsewhere, fixated, not on celebration, but on suspicion. He stared into the infant's eyes as if they were mirrors. "Does she look like me?" he whispered to a servant. "Do you see it? The nose, the ears?" The servant dared not answer, because everyone knew she was born of Maria Cristina's betrayal, of the court's desperation, of a conspiracy clothed in lace and velvet. Isabella was not born of Ferdinand's grotesque seed. And yet, to the world she was legitimate. She would be queen. He commissioned dozens of portraits of the baby, comparing each one to paintings of himself at various ages, as if pigment could resolve paternity. Ferdinand clung to this fragile fiction, like a dying man grasping at a rosary. He summoned genealogists, physiognomists, even phrenologists to examine her skull. "Prove she's mine," he demanded. Ferdinand installed peepholes in the walls of Maria Christine's chambers. He watched her pray. He watched her sleep. He watched her nurse the child. And they did. With lies and diagrams. Because to deny the king's blood was to invite the axe. But lies cannot calm a mind that feeds on fear. The palace became a labyrinth of paranoia. He assigned spies to catalog her every movement. How long she bathed, how many steps she took between rooms, what expression she wore during mass. He timed her heartbeat. He counted the chews of her food. Several tasters collapsed from exhaustion. One went mad. "I wake to the sound of footsteps I cannot see." Meals were delayed by hours as servants tasted each dish. Not once, but twice, with 30-minute intervals to detect slow poisons. Her hair thinned. Her hands shook. Ministers were subjected to loyalty tests, wherein he would issue contradictory commands to see who dared correct him. She began speaking to herself, then stopped speaking entirely. Smiles became masks. Her silence, survival, Ferdinand interpreted it all as proof of plots. Maria Cristina, once the proud princess of Naples, became a captive actress, performing sainthood before the watchful eyes of a man crumbling in body and soul. Her letters home, all intercepted, revealed the terror she lived with. I move like a shadow in my own house. I sleep with my back to the wall. The queen's health deteriorated. Ferdinand's court transformed into a theater of delusion. He rotated guards weekly, convinced they were being corrupted by foreign agents. He interpreted corrections as treason, the living embodiment of everything Ferdinand had failed to be. He interpreted silence as treason. Physicians were ordered to inspect her skin, her breath, her inner thighs in the presence of the king. The walls listened. The paintings stared. Even birthday gifts were examined for hidden codes or poisons concealed in perfume. And Isabella, its coffers, empty. Its court, a circus of cowards. He searched for the truth, all the while maintaining the lie. She became the axis of it all. He both adored and resented her. A perfect, golden child born of another man's the ultimate betrayal. He would cradle her in his arms, kiss her forehead, then stare at her for hours with a gaze too still to be loving. He commissioned artists to sketch her features, then ordered them to compare the drawings with every potential father who had ever looked at Maria Cristina sideways. He barked at ghosts, held court with dead advisors, ordered executions that had already happened. He interrogated footmen. He bribed midwives, and, malformed, scarred by decades of self-surgery, crude attempts to reshape the fate that fate had dealt him. The bedroom he shared with Maria Cristina became a museum of his failures. Broken instruments, anatomical drawings, the preserved death masks of 3 wives, and at the center, a crib, the daughter who would rule because he could not, but his mind, like his body, was failing. By 1832, Ferdinand suffered tremors, digestive seizures, and what modern medicine would call early dementia. He suspected Maria Cristina of trying to poison him through her touch. But men of flesh and failure, obsessed with what they cannot control, and damned by what they cannot change. He demanded that she undergo medical examinations before they shared a room. His legacy, a reminder. She never spoke of it again. Spain, once the crown of the New World, had become a ghost empire ruled by a ghost king. Its colonies were gone. Ambassadors wrote home of the horror behind the palace walls. Europe watched and waited. On a cold night in 1833, Ferdinand collapsed while ordering the secret dissection of a letter opener he believed contained a curse. He never recovered. He died whispering nonsense, drenched in sweat, calling out the names of wives, physicians, and traitors, as if they were all the same. The official cause was listed as gout, but the palace physicians knew the truth. Ferdinand VII died of exhaustion. Physical, psychological, spiritual. The long, slow death of a man betrayed by his own body. The autopsy, conducted in secret, confirmed the rumors. His member, grotesquely large, the preserved organ, along with drawings and reports, was locked in the Vatican archives, where it remains to this day, a relic too monstrous for sainthood, too human for myth. And so, Spain passed to Isabella II, a child whose birth marked the end of monarchy's illusion of divine perfection. She inherited not just a crown, but a curse. Ferdinand VII, the most anatomically afflicted monarch in European history, became a legend of shame, his wives dead, his country broken. That personal madness, when crowned, becomes national tragedy, and that sometimes the most terrifying tyrants are not monsters of ambition,